let's talk about user interfaces, and particularly about the Facebook user interface. You'll hear an interview with Greg Badros about Facebook user interface, and I want to prepare you for that. I want to first give you the idea of, well, what is a user interface? Every machine, whether it's a video camera or a phone or a car or a hammer, anything that's a machine has some sort of way that you operate it, some way to control it, some way to make it do the things that it does. We call that the user interface. So our entire computers, so that's all user interface across all machines. Now let's focus in on user interface that's on computers. The computer itself has a user interface. So if you're on a Macintosh, you might call that OS X is the user, it provides the user interface. There's some program and there's commands and there's folders and all those kinds of things. That's the user interface of the computer itself. The browser that you look at Facebook in has a user interface. So the browser itself has commands. There's a home command, the home button, and there's a little place where you type in URLs, and there's favorites and all those kind of things. All those bits and pieces constitute the user interface, the way that you work the browser. So there's a way that you work the computer. That's the computer's user interface. There's the way that you work the browser. That's the browser's user interface. And then within the browser, there's Facebook, and Facebook has a user interface. The way that you operate Facebook, the way that you make Facebook do the things that it does. That's the user interface of Facebook. So every machine has a user interface, and your computer has multiple user interfaces all interacting at the same time. There's the computer itself has a user interface, Windows or Macintosh user interface, whatever it is. There's the browser that has its user interface, how you make the browser do what it does. And then there's Facebook that has a user interface. How do you make Facebook do what it does? All nested inside of each other. So what is a user interface exactly? Well, the user interface really consists of controls, things that allow you to make things happen. In addition, usually we throw in some other parts into the user interface as well as controls. The controls are the things that make things happen. When you click on a link, that's a control. It's controlling something. It's making something happen. When you click on a button, that's a control. That makes something happen. When you drop down a menu and choose something from the menu, that's a control. It makes something happen. It's a command. It tells Facebook or the browser or the computer, whatever it is, whatever level you're working on, it tells it what to do. Usually when we talk about user interface, we also include other things besides the controls that are action-oriented, that make things happen. We talk about the different areas of the display as being part of the user interface. So we have, as part of our user interface, a banner at the top, navigation on the side, and a footer on the bottom, for example. So we can include those display areas as well as part of the user interface. We can include decorations as well as part of the interface. The fonts that we use and the colors that we use and the images and logos and all those kinds of things that kind of decorate the edges of the presentation. We usually include those when we talk about user interface as well. And then finally, we include content often when we talk about user interface. The pictures and text and videos and sound clips and all those kinds of things that we display on the page are also generally thought of as part of the user interface. So the user interface really specifically is the control mechanism. It's the buttons that you press and the dials that you turn and the things that you click on to make stuff happen. That's the real core of the user interface. But surrounding that are display areas and different kinds of decorations, different kind of embellishments on the screen, as well as content that you might see on the screen. Now, of course, where's the dividing line between content and control? When I have a hyperlink and I click on a piece of text and that piece of text takes me to another page, is that content or is that a control? Well, the answer is it's functioning in both ways. It's functioning as content and also as a control. So, as usual, the simple explanation of there's content and there's controls breaks down upon further examination, and we see that it's a lot more complicated than that. At any rate, a user interface, really the core of the interface is the controls. Surrounding the controls are all these other sort of embellishments on the controls. All right, so now let's get closer to what we really want to get at, which is how is the user interface, how is the way Facebook works determined? How do the people at Facebook figure that out? What do they do? We have to look at two different aspects of user interface, a technical aspect for user interface and a human aspect for user interface. The technical aspect is how literally do you make that user interface happen? We know that that Facebook runs in a browser. If it runs in a browser, then it's using HTML, and so HTML is being used to construct a user interface. Okay, so that's the right way to think about it. The user interface is being constructed using HTML. You know from previous discussions that HTML is all about layout, putting things on the screen and making them look a certain way, right? One of the things we put on the screen are these controls that determine the user interface, and the screen areas and the decorations and the content. Those are all things that are done by HTML. So HTML is the language we use in order to create the user interface. So there are issues, and there are issues that keep user interfaces from being as good as they could be. And one of the biggest issues that is just a continuing pain in the butt is the existence of various different browsers that all work a little bit differently. So making the Facebook page work as well on a Macintosh as it does on a PC, making it work as well in Firefox as it does in Safari, all those issues are huge ones and concern the people who design user interfaces a lot. And oftentimes something doesn't happen or happens in a worse way because they can't figure out how to make it work well across all of those different browsers. Worked really great in one browser, completely bombs in another browser, so we have to change our methodology and do something much simpler. So that constraint of having it work across platforms, across different browsers, as well, unfortunately, as making it work across different hardware. So Facebook has to work on your mobile phone as well as working on your browser, right? So those constraints are severe constraints on the user interface, severe constraints on how we can make things happen. So that's a technological constraint. And there's also a time constraint. What can we do in the time we have to make this user interface work? What can we pack into this time? If we had infinite time, we could make lots of different things happen, but we have limited time. So we're going to have to simplify, and we're going to have to make things that maybe aren't as fancy as we wanted them to be because of time and effort constraints. Okay, so those are the technological aspects of user interface design. It's all about what can we manage to do, given the technology constraints, given the time constraints. But then, and really more interestingly, to me anyway, is the human constraints. What kind of user interface works for the kinds of people that we're targeting? Facebook really has a difficult problem here because they're targeting everybody on the planet. You know, there's nobody who they don't want to be a Facebook user, all the way from someone who's never really used a computer before, all the way up to the people who work at Facebook who, you know, live, breathe, eat, and poop computers. So how do they make a user interface that will work for the people, that will be understandable to the people that need to use it? What looks good? What's attractive? What is something that people will want to use? What's a really clean approach? Google, it's said oftentimes, has an approach that is very compelling because it's super simple. When you go to the Google homepage, it just says Google, and then there's a box and then a little button that says, am I feeling lucky? Right? That's a very simple user interface, and they like it. It's very clean, as opposed to maybe a news site like CNN.com that's got a very busy, a very fancy, a very complicated and intricate user interface with lots of controls all over the place. Okay, so what works for people, and that we call usability. Is it possible for them to use it? Can they find their way around it? What looks good? What's going to be attractive and people are going to be compelled or encouraged to use it? What's consistent with people's expectations? There's lots of applications that we use, lots of websites that we use. Do we, in our case, want to just mimic the way everybody does it, or do we want to break new ground and do it in a very different way? That's all about how are we going to meet people's expectations? How are we going to set their expectations? How are we going to meet those expectations? So it's all about interacting with individuals, and that's really difficult. Very, very difficult. And then finally, and maybe most importantly for the user interface from the human aspects, is how does that user interface communicate to the people who are going to use it, telling them what's possible and what they should do next? How does it have sort of a conversation? And that's probably the way that I like to look at user interfaces the best, is that they're a conversation. You come to a page and you're asking yourself, what can I do? What's possible? What are the things that I should be thinking about right now? And a good user interface will suggest things to you. It'll say, this is probably what you want to do. Sometimes it suggests it, like the thing that's happening now in the user interface of Facebook, which is kind of a pain, is it's in your face. Right now there's new options for controlling the privacy of posts, and every time I go to post, I get this little pop-up box saying you should think about this. Right? Well, you know, that's kind of a pain to have that pop up in my face all the time, even though I understand it's a new feature. They want to inform me about it, and hopefully eventually they'll make it a little bit more streamlined. But that's an example of Facebook trying to tell me what's possible and what I should be thinking about right now. So those are the human aspects of user interface design. There are technical aspects that are all about the constraints and how do we meet the constraints. There are human aspects all about how do we communicate with the people who are using this application and how do we get them to know what they can do, be happy to do it, be easily led from feature to feature to feature of our application, and be attracted to our application as well. All right, you're going to hear Greg talk about how they decide on the big new features. So when something big like video conferencing is now coming on strong in Facebook, how do they decide to do that kind of stuff? What are the constraints? And you'll hear him talk about a number of different things about how they decide. First of all, what's possible? What could we do? What's within our technological constraints? If things change and video conferencing is now well supported in most people's browsers, and so we can do that, for example. And frankly, for any commercial organization, and Facebook is a commercial organization, what's going to make them money? What's going to be able to forward their economic aims? What's going to be able to entice you to click on their advertisements, for example, which is a big way that Facebook makes money? What's natural given the mission of the company? Facebook is all around connecting people, and you'll see Greg say that, well, it's obvious that we want to do video conferencing because that's a big way to connect people, and that's something that they're going to expect, and that's a logical extension of our mission, a logical extension of the things that we want to do. And then finally, what's cool? There are people at Facebook all the time saying, oh, wouldn't it be awesome if ... right? Never underestimate the power of cool in deciding what a new application will do. So you'll see Greg say that we have lots of people here at Facebook all testing and staying a couple of years ahead of other people and figuring out what's cool, what's going to be the next big thing. They are their own audience, and so they're trying to figure out as best as possible from their own use of their application what it should do next. All right, I want to bring us to the prime paradox, I like to think, of user interface design, and that's control versus simplicity. Or you might think about it as complexity versus flexibility. They're all different ways of saying the same thing. If I want to have a user interface that pretty much anybody who comes to it knows what to do, I'm going to make it very, very simple. I'm going to have the minimum number of different controls all competing for your attention. That's simplicity. But if you think about it, well, I have a screen that only has one control. Well, I guess then you can only do one thing. Right? Well, what if you have a complicated thing like Facebook's got lots and lots going on? How do I thread that needle? How do I stay on that knife edge between making it easy for people who don't already know how to use it, making it easy for them, but making it up to the task of people who are power users, people who want to do fancy things with it? How do I have those things going on all at the same time? How do I please the newbies and at the same time make the oldies feel like there's always new cool things that they can do on my application? So that's a big contradiction, and you'll hear Greg talk about that as well. How can you make it so that it's simple enough that anybody can use it, but powerful enough that people who have very sophisticated uses for it can use it as well?
Facebook has a user interface, and it's all laid out on the screen, and different screen areas have different content in them. How is that managed? How does your system decide what goes where on the page, and then make sure that it all gets to the right place?
Yeah. So I mean, at the most superficial level, of course, we use HTML tables to determine the layout of the page, and we have a bunch of UI engineers and designers who are really skilled in the art of HTML layout in a way that renders quickly and behaves, efficiently in your browser. Obviously, that space is very complex with multiple different browsers, each having different market shares, and we're trying to make sure that the experience is great no matter what browser you're on. So that's a real challenge. In terms of behind the scenes, there's a lot of work that our design team and our product management teams do to try to shape the way that we want those things to be laid out, and try to inform the choices around layout so that it's easily understandable to users, it is efficient for experienced users, it's easy to learn for new users, and so forth.
Do you do testing and sort of, I mean, it seems like the Facebook UI changes relatively slowly. what would cause you to move something from one place to another place on the screen?
Yeah, I mean, we would absolutely do several kinds of testing. There are probably 3 different kinds of testing that we focus on. First and foremost is we use it ourselves every day. So every employee at this company every day has a Facebook window, if not multiple Facebook windows up, and we're using the latest versions of the code that we've submitted. So we are constantly
tracking. So it's okay to use Facebook at work?
Absolutely. I think
you're the only company on the planet.
I wish there would be more.
What would cause you to add a new big feature to Facebook?
Well,
recently you had you're starting to do video chat, and what triggers that large scale of a change?
Absolutely. So, I mean, we really are trying to make the site as compelling and engaging as we can for our users. Sometimes that means listening to the users and trying to understand exactly what it is that people are most asking for and trying to make that stuff great. We spend a lot of energy trying to make the site more reliable, make the site faster. Those are things that we know that users are going to appreciate, even though they're not necessarily always asking for it. There's also just opportunities given changes in the way hardware and the way networking infrastructure is and so forth. Video chat has gotten more and more cost effective over the years, and it's something that, given our fundamental mission is about sharing and helping people connect and bring the world closer together, video chat just seems like a very natural extension of that mission. There's not much better than face-to-face communication, and if you can't be there together in person, then being able to do it over distance with technology bridging that gap is a wonderful addition to what we're trying to do.
Right.
And some of these things are influenced by just the design of solving problems that we see happening because we as Facebook employees are using the site in a way that's kind of a couple years ahead of the way that the public at large is using things. So maybe we notice that, wow, when you have 1,000 friends, your news feed gets very noisy and there's lots of stuff going on. So we're constantly experimenting with different ranking algorithms that may. But this trade-off between control and simplicity is actually a really interesting and really fundamental one to all user interface design. And the amount of control that you give users often corresponds to increased complexity. And we really strive towards having a site that anybody can use without any training whatsoever. And trying to make that scale up to becoming a really sophisticated user with thousands of friends and so forth is an interesting design and user interface challenge.
Very interesting. So what's your insight into that? The difference between having it be really simple but you can't do much versus really complicated but it takes a lot of learning to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
How do you approach that?
Yeah, well, again, we typically, because we're dog fooding everything and we tend to be on the high end of stuff, we tend to, more and more of the suggestions coming from employees and from engineers at the company tend to focus on more of those power users. So we constantly have to push back towards simplicity because most people design things as if they're going to use them themselves. And I think it's been important to have sort of the sensibilities around what an average user can do and being sure that anytime that we introduce a new control, we are considering how that impacts confusion and how that impacts the average user's use of the site. And again, we're always watching to see, wow, does that change make users come back to the site less often? Does that change make users click on things in the news feed less often? Or does it help the experience? Does it make them come back more often? Does it make people click on things more often?
Right. So it's very experimental.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very experimental. At the same time, I think we've been blessed with an amazing product team, an amazing design team, amazing engineering team, and we have good intuitions about the way these things work after years and years of iterating on these experiments. So Mark Zuckerberg in particular is very, very involved with the product decisions and how these things work and has a fantastic intuition for these things in a way that has been informed by years and years of doing these experiments and seeing what the results look like.